Sarah and Tom Miller thought they had found the perfect babysitter in Emma Turner, a friendly, reliable young woman who seemed to adore their 17-month-old son, Ethan. But when tragedy struck, they were forced to confront a nightmare they never saw coming. Emma, the trusted caregiver they had welcomed into their home, was not the person they thought she was. What started as a simple day of childcare ended with the unimaginable. Their precious son, Ethan, was dead. The truth behind his death would expose a shocking betrayal that left a family shattered and a community reeling. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, nestled between tree-lined streets and cozy houses, the Miller family lived a peaceful and contented life. Sarah and Tom Miller were just like any other parents, trying to balance their work with raising their precious 17-month-old son, Ethan. Their home was filled with laughter and warmth as they enjoyed the early stages of parenthood. However, like many working parents, Sarah and Tom found themselves in need of help. They couldn't afford to juggle work and childcare on their own, so they began their search for the perfect babysitter. After several interviews, they came across Emma Turner, a young woman in her early 20s who seemed to be the ideal fit for their family. Emma was recommended by a mutual acquaintance, and her references were glowing. She appeared responsible, reliable, and loving toward children, with a passion for taking care of little ones. Emma's resume was impressive, and her kind smile gave Sarah and Tom a sense of ease. After careful consideration, they hired her to look after Ethan while they were at work. In the beginning, everything seemed perfect. Emma arrived on time each day, greeted Ethan with a warm embrace, and immediately engaged with him. Ethan, though young, responded to her with laughter and delight, which further reassured Sarah and Tom. They were pleased with how easily Emma adapted to their home, following their guidelines and ensuring Ethan's safety and comfort. She quickly became a familiar, trusted figure in the household. For weeks, there were no issues. Emma would send Sarah brief updates during the day, sending pictures of Ethan playing, napping, and enjoying his meals. There was no sign of any trouble. Sarah and Tom were grateful for Emma's help and felt confident in their decision. They were aware of the challenges that came with hiring someone to care for their child, but Emma seemed to be exactly what they needed. As time went on, the Millers grew more comfortable, and they began to see Emma almost as part of the family. Ethan began to develop a bond with her. He would smile when he saw her arrive in the morning and often giggled when she played with him. But as with any story, there are often small details that can be overlooked. Sarah, in hindsight, would recall moments when Emma seemed a little more tired or frazzled than usual. There were brief mentions of Ethan's constant crying or his refusal to nap, things that many toddlers do, but Emma's patience appeared to be thinning. Sarah attributed these comments to the natural stress of childcare, as it was common for parents and caregivers to become exhausted from the demands of a young child. However, these were early warning signs that Sarah didn't recognize at the time. Emma began to show subtle signs of frustration. Ethan was a typical toddler, full of energy and curiosity, which meant he required constant attention. At first, Sarah chalked up Emma's occasional comments about how difficult it was to keep up with Ethan to simple exhaustion. She assured herself that Emma, like many young babysitters, was just overwhelmed by the demands of caring for such a young child. It seemed normal. But looking back, Sarah would come to realize that those small moments of tension were just the beginning of a much darker story that would unfold. What the Millers didn't know was that under Emma's friendly exterior, something more sinister was slowly growing. As the weeks passed, small signs began to appear that something was off, though Sarah and Tom couldn't quite pinpoint what was wrong. Ethan, who had been a cheerful and playful child, started to appear more withdrawn whenever they returned home after work. His once bright eyes seemed dimmer, and he cried more easily. The changes were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but Sarah began to notice that he seemed a little less animated when Emma was around. One evening, after picking up Ethan from his usual time with Emma, Sarah noticed a bruise on the back of his arm. It was small, but dark and raised. Her heart sank as she asked Ethan through his limited toddler vocabulary what had happened, but he could offer no explanation. When she confronted Emma about it, Emma seemed embarrassed and quickly brushed it off. She claimed that Ethan had simply bumped into a piece of furniture while playing. It seemed like a reasonable explanation, and Sarah, although uneasy, chose to give Emma the benefit of the doubt. She reassured herself that children often get bumps and bruises without their parents knowing exactly how. A few days later, Sarah noticed another bruise, this time on Ethan's leg. It wasn't as small or as easy to explain away as the first one. This time, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She asked Emma again, but this time, Emma seemed more defensive. She said that Ethan was just accident-prone, and that he often got bruises when he was playing. Emma's explanation was quick and convincing, but the worry in Sarah's mind grew. Sarah knew children could get bumps, but the bruises were starting to appear with alarming frequency. Still, Sarah didn't want to jump to conclusions. She didn't want to believe that someone she had trusted so much could hurt her child. She was desperate to find another explanation, and so she chalked it up to the rough-and-tumble nature of toddlers. Maybe Ethan was simply going through a phase of being more active and reckless. Yet the more Sarah observed, the more she began to notice how Ethan's demeanor seemed to change when Emma was around. He appeared more reserved and sometimes even cried out when Sarah left for work, which was unusual for him. There was an unsettling feeling in Sarah's gut that she couldn't ignore, but she chose to dismiss it for the sake of maintaining a sense of normalcy. It wasn't until one afternoon when Sarah picked Ethan up and found a strange red patch of irritated skin on his back that her doubts became impossible to ignore. This patch looked like it had been rubbed raw, the skin irritated and inflamed. It didn't look like the kind of injury a child could get from simply playing. The redness seemed deliberate, almost as if someone had caused it. Sarah felt a cold wave of panic rise in her chest. She tried to remain calm, but her instincts told her that something far worse was happening. When Sarah confronted Emma about the patch on Ethan's back, Emma seemed unusually evasive. She muttered that it might have been from Ethan's high chair, or the way he had been positioned during nap time. But there was no plausible explanation that made sense to Sarah. The more Emma spoke, the less certain Sarah felt. She started to ask herself if she had missed something all along. Was this just a simple case of bruises and scratches, or was it something much darker? Sarah couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at her any longer. There was a part of her that wanted to believe the best in Emma, but everything pointed to something deeply troubling. As she lay awake at night thinking about the bruises and the strange behavior she'd noticed, she realized that her gut was telling her the truth. Something was terribly wrong, but she had no idea just how horrifying the reality would be. One morning, as the sun rose over the quiet suburban neighborhood, Sarah and Tom kissed Ethan goodbye, as they did every weekday. They said their usual goodbyes to their young son before heading off to work. The routine was comforting. It was just Another day, just like all the others. Emma arrived promptly and everything seemed normal. Ethan, still in his pajamas, was playing in the living room, waiting for his babysitter to start the day. Hours later, a frantic phone call shattered their routine. Emma's voice, usually so composed, was now strained and filled with panic. She was frantic as she told Sarah that Ethan had fallen from his high chair and wasn't breathing properly. She begged Sarah to come home immediately, her words rushed and shaky. Confused and terrified, Sarah quickly called Tom, urging him to rush home too. Neither of them could process what they were hearing. Sarah's heart raced as she hung up, her mind flooded with fear and disbelief. Could it really be just a fall? Was Ethan okay? As they drove home, Sarah's mind swirled with thoughts of her son. What had happened? Was it an accident? But deep down, something didn't feel right. It couldn't be that simple. The worst fear was creeping up on her, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. When Sarah and Tom arrived at their house, the sight that greeted them was enough to make their blood run cold. Paramedics surrounded their small living room and Ethan was lying on the floor, his tiny body lifeless. His face was pale and his limbs lay motionless. A paramedic was performing CPR, his chest compressions steady, but there was no sign of life. Emma stood off to the side, her face a mask of panic, but Sarah could see the guilt in her eyes. She didn't even need to ask what happened. It was clear that something was terribly wrong. The paramedics rushed Ethan to the hospital, but despite their desperate attempts to save him, it was too late. Ethan was declared dead upon arrival. Sarah collapsed, her heart breaking in pieces. Tom stood beside her, his face pale and stricken with disbelief. They couldn't understand it. Their sweet, vibrant son was gone. How could this have happened? Why was their child taken from them in such a cruel, inexplicable way? The hospital staff asked Sarah and Tom questions, trying to gather details, but their minds were too overwhelmed with grief to process it all. Emma was already gone by the time they arrived at the hospital, her presence a distant memory. The police were notified, and the investigation began almost immediately. At first it seemed like a tragic accident, a fall, a simple mistake. But something about the situation didn't add up. Ethan's injuries were severe, and they weren't consistent with a fall from a high chair. Doctors began to perform an autopsy, and what they discovered sent shockwaves through everyone involved. Ethan's small body had been subjected to far more than just a fall. There were multiple internal injuries, bruises, and signs of blunt force trauma. His death wasn't the result of a simple accident, as Emma had claimed. It was much more sinister. The extent of his injuries revealed that someone had been deliberately hurting him, and it had been going on for some time. The detectives quickly took Emma into custody, but her story was full of contradictions and lies. She first claimed that the injury was caused by a fall, but the evidence told a different story. Ethan's injuries didn't match the scenario she described, and when the authorities began to dig deeper, they uncovered a pattern of abuse. The bruises, the marks on Ethan's skin, and the tension Sarah had felt over the past few weeks all made sense now. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was a carefully concealed campaign of violence. Emma had been hiding behind a facade of kindness and reliability, but underneath it, a dangerous and twisted side had been brewing. The woman Sarah had trusted with her son had betrayed that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. Emma had not just caused Ethan's death. It was clear now that she had been systematically torturing the child for weeks, inflicting pain and fear upon him until that tragic day when his little body couldn't take it anymore. What seemed like a simple fall was, in reality, the final act in a pattern of abuse that no one had seen coming. The investigation was only just beginning, but Sarah and Tom were already dealing with the harshest reality imaginable: the loss of their son and the crushing betrayal from someone they had welcomed into their home. The world had turned upside down, and nothing would ever be the same. As the investigation into Ethan's death progressed, the detectives uncovered a chilling series of events that painted a horrifying picture of what had been happening inside the Miller household. Emma Turner, the once trusted babysitter, was arrested and brought in for questioning. Her calm demeanor and practiced answers during the early stages of the investigation began to unravel under the weight of mounting evidence. Initially, Emma stuck to her story. She insisted that Ethan's injuries were the result of an accident, a fall from his high chair that she hadn't been able to prevent. But the medical examiner's report told a much different story. Ethan's cause of death was blunt force trauma, not the simple fall Emma had claimed. The bruises on his body weren't consistent with any fall. They were deep, fresh, and numerous. There was also evidence of older injuries, ones that had been inflicted days or even weeks prior, showing a pattern of abuse that could no longer be ignored. The forensic team discovered additional marks on Ethan's body that suggested he had been physically restrained and possibly shaken violently at times. These were not the signs of a child who had been accident-prone, as Emma had suggested. Rather, they were the signs of someone who had been deliberately hurting him, someone who had taken out their frustrations on a helpless toddler. The more the investigators dug, the clearer it became that this was no tragic accident. This was a carefully concealed campaign of cruelty. The investigators also found traces of bruises in places that were hidden from view, such as under his clothes, making it harder for Sarah and Tom to notice. Ethan had been left alone for hours, subjected to pain and fear in the presence of someone he should have been able to trust. The investigators examined the security footage from the Miller household's cameras, which offered crucial evidence. There, hidden behind a veil of normalcy, was a record of Emma's behavior, a far cry from the image she had projected to Sarah and Tom. The footage revealed moments of disturbing violence. Emma could be seen forcefully shaking Ethan when he cried, slapping his tiny hands away when he reached for his toys, and even pushing him roughly into his crib when he wouldn't stop crying. These unsettling moments were punctuated by longer periods of Emma sitting idly in the corner watching as Ethan cried out for attention, offering no comfort. In one particularly chilling scene, Emma can be seen turning her back on Ethan as he sobbed alone in his crib. It was clear that she was far from the kind, nurturing caregiver that Sarah and Tom had believed her to be. Instead, she was a person capable of unimaginable cruelty. The authorities discovered that Emma had been fired from previous babysitting jobs due to similar complaints of inappropriate behavior and unexplained injuries to children in her care. The Millers were shocked. How could they have missed these red flags? They had trusted Emma because of the glowing references and her seemingly warm nature, but it became painfully clear that she had been hiding her true self behind a mask of friendliness. As the investigation deepened, Emma's story became increasingly inconsistent. At first, she stuck to her initial explanation of the fall, but as the evidence piled up, she began to change her narrative. She claimed that she had acted out of frustration, but then, under intense questioning, she broke down. Emma confessed to harming Ethan, but her explanations were disturbing and nonsensical. She spoke of her inability to handle the constant crying, her feelings of exhaustion, and her growing resentment toward Ethan for being difficult to manage. It seemed that Emma had never seen Ethan as a child to care for, but rather as an inconvenience, one that she had grown increasingly willing to hurt as the days went on. The confession was chilling, but it was also revealing. Emma had carefully concealed her anger and violence behind a smile, manipulating the Millers into believing that she was the perfect caregiver. What had started as a simple act of frustration had escalated into something far worse, a deliberate campaign of abuse that ultimately led to Ethan's death. In the wake of Emma's arrest, Sarah and Tom were left reeling. They had trusted her with their most precious possession, their son, and she had betrayed them in the most unimaginable way. The loss of Ethan was devastating enough, but now they had to grapple with the horrifying realization that they had allowed someone who was capable of such cruelty into their lives. The shock and grief of losing their child were compounded by the shock of betrayal. Emma's actions had destroyed their family, and nothing could ever bring Ethan back. They could only move forward with the painful knowledge that their trust had been violated in the worst way possible. As Emma's trial approached, the Millers were left to grapple with a reality that no parent should ever have to face. The brutal truth of Ethan's death weighed heavily on them, and though they had come to terms with the fact that justice would be served, the emotional scars would never fully heal. The case became a media sensation, with news outlets covering every detail, from Emma's arrest to the revelations about her behavior. The community, once shocked by the sweet babysitter who had seemingly turned on an innocent child, struggled to comprehend how someone so young, so outwardly kind, could commit such an unthinkable crime. The trial was an agonizing experience for Sarah and Tom. Sitting in that courtroom, they had to relive the worst day of their lives. Emma, once a trusted figure in their home, now sat across from them in a stark orange jumpsuit. Her appearance had changed since the arrest. Her face was gaunt, and her eyes seemed distant. The once friendly babysitter who had cared for their son was now an accused murderer. Her defense team tried to build a case around her emotional instability, claiming that Emma's actions were the result of an untreated mental illness. They argued that Emma had been overwhelmed by the stress of caring for a toddler and had reached a breaking point, unable to cope with the constant demands of a child she couldn't manage. The prosecution, on the other hand, presented a clear and devastating case. The evidence was overwhelming. The forensic examination of Ethan's body showed a pattern of physical abuse. The surveillance footage, which had been so damning, painted a horrifying picture of Emma's behavior. The footage showed her deliberately shaking Ethan, ignoring his cries, and treating him with cold indifference. It was clear that this was not an isolated incident, but a pattern of escalating abuse. The medical reports showed that Ethan had suffered multiple injuries over time, none of which were consistent with an accident. This was not a caregiver snapping under pressure. It was a calculated, cruel course of action. As Emma's defense tried to argue her mental state, it became clear to the jury that nothing could excuse her behavior. The psychologist who evaluated Emma during the trial stated that she exhibited symptoms of a personality disorder, one that caused her to lack empathy and be prone to violent outbursts. While the defense suggested that Emma's mental state played a role in the abuse, the E-team prosecution reminded the court that even with her mental illness, Emma had made conscious decisions to harm Ethan over a period of weeks. It was a slow unraveling of the truth, each layer revealing a person who had concealed her true nature behind a facade of kindness. In the end, Emma pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, a decision that shocked many, as it spared the family from the pain of a drawn-out trial, but also left many wondering whether she truly understood the gravity of her actions. Emma was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's ruling was met with mixed emotions, relief for Sarah and Tom, but also a deep sadness that no punishment could ever bring Ethan back. For the Millers, the years ahead would be defined by grief. They would never see their son again, and the space he left behind in their hearts could never be filled. The questions would never cease. Why had they trusted Emma? How had they missed the signs? But amid the sorrow, they knew one thing: Ethan's story could not be forgotten. They would carry his memory with them, doing everything in their power to raise awareness about the importance of vetting those who care for our children. Ethan's death had sparked a conversation about the dangers that lurk behind the masks of seemingly perfect individuals. For Sarah and Tom, their mission became clear: to use their pain to help others avoid the same fate. Through advocacy and speaking out, they hoped to prevent other families from suffering the same heartbreaking betrayal. The road to healing would be long, but they were determined to honor their son's memory by ensuring that the tragic story of Ethan Miller was not just a headline, but a lasting lesson for every parent and caregiver.